Hey guys, my name's Ed, and welcome to Lesson 5 of my How to Code in PHP web series. Today I'm going to teach you guys how to build a simple contact form in PHP. If you haven't already, check out my previous lessons if you're a total beginner to PHP, because I cover a lot of the basics there. And so this lesson, I'm going to show you guys how to collect a name, email address, and a message from somebody, and then email it to yourself from your website. So let's get started. I have open here a file I created called test.php. You can set your form up wherever you want to do this. And go ahead and, if you haven't already built a web form, here's a simple one that I'm going to be working with. I just wrote this before filming this to save some time. And most importantly, just change the action up here to whatever the name of your web page is. In this case, mine is test.php. So whatever your current file name is in your folder that you're working on, go ahead and change it to the name of your file and extension here. Alright guys, so this is what the form actually looks like in the web browser. And again, you can build this however you want with however many fields you want, but this is just a pretty straightforward, simple approach. And to get started with the PHP, at the very top of your web page, your document where you're doing this at, go ahead and create an opening and closing PHP tag. And now, so there's no right or wrong way to build a web form, but this is the method that I like to use, and it's really simple and easy to do on any website, and saves a lot of time. So notice the server variable method equals 1. So this tells me, or indicates, that the user actually clicked and submitted the web form. If that variable's set, then we know they actually did that action, and we can validate their input and then send the message to ourselves if everything's successful and they filled it out right. That way, if they come here and they don't click anything, then it doesn't try to submit an email or anything to you or do any of the input validation unless they actually submitted the page. So that's what I use that for. So to actually collect the server variable method, I'm going to create a variable called method, and first I'm going to use the isSet function to try and collect that. So isSet and then get method. So if you watch my previous lessons, we learned what server variables are and what get means. And now beside this, I am going to use a ternary operator in PHP, and it's just a question mark like this. And then I'm going to write get method, and then beside here I'm going to put a colon symbol and just an empty string. So to explain what this does, this is basically an evaluation thing with ternary operators. We're going to detect if get has a value using the isSet function, and if not, then it's going to give it just a blank value as a string. Below this we can use an if statement, something we haven't got into yet, but now we are. If method equals 1, and in here we'll put brackets, just like if you were writing a function. And now we can actually collect and validate all this user input here. And here I'm going to first collect my name input, and notice the name equals name, so that means that the name of my post data will be name. So I'm going to put a variable called name and use the predefined PHP variable called post, has an underscore and all capitalized POST like this, and a set of square brackets and the name of my input. And that will collect the name field right here. And then the email, same thing. I'm going to duplicate this line and replace both of those with email. And it's basically the same thing, except now we're collecting the name of the email field. So just make sure that the post references the name of the inputs from the form you're collecting them from. And then last but not least, I have a text area with a message here. And it's the same thing. Doesn't matter if it's an input or a text area or a select dropdown or radio buttons. You can collect all of them with post, as long as they're being submitted as post data with this method here. And I'm going to save that, make sure there's no errors here. Okay. Alright, let's say I actually wanted to validate this user input and force them to enter their name and email address in here. Well, there's a few ways I could do that. First of all, in your inputs in your HTML, you could put the required attribute inside of the input. And this will force the web browser or force the user in a browser to actually enter those. So if I go back to my page here and I try to submit this without filling those, I'll get a please fill out this form. So that's one thing you can do, but it's obviously not a good idea to depend on the web browser to validate our inputs, because if they're using an older browser which doesn't support this required attribute or HTML5, then they're going to be able to click that anyway. So we should validate it in our PHP, and that's what we're going to do next. So in here, I'm going to create a Boolean variable. Boolean means true or false. I'm going to call it valid and equals false. And I am going to use this later on to determine if I should submit this message and email it to myself or not. So the first thing we're going to validate is the name. We are going to use the empty function. And earlier I incorrectly called it isEmpty. It's just called empty. PHP variables or functions are confusing. So, and here I'm going to put my name variable, and then I'm going to create a set of open brackets here. And if the name field is not entered, I want to show the user a message that says echo warning, name is a required field. And inside here, actually, my valid variable, I'm going to set it to true up here. And then inside of here, I'm going to put false. So if the name is not filled out, or filled out, then that means that the submission of this form is no good, in which case it's not valid. And now I'm going to do the same with the email field now. If empty email address, echo warning, email is a required field, and valid equals false. Now I'm going to remove these required attributes in my HTML just to show how the PHP code works. I'm going to refresh and send message, and there it is. So for each one of them fields that aren't filled out, I get a warning up here. Warning name is required, warning email is required. If I want to space those out a little nicer, I can just put some break tags in here. But that is a very basic and simple way of how we can validate inputs and make sure somebody actually filled something out. Okay, if you're following along with me and you've been testing your form so far, notice the method up in your address bar. That'll be set to 1 if you submitted. So I'm going to go ahead and erase that and just take me back to my plain form before I actually did anything or submitted it. So that's a little trick for you to make sure that you start from scratch. And now I actually want to send myself an email with all of this information. And the way I could do that is I will create a message field, message equals, and I'm going to use a set of open parentheses, not single quotes. And the reason why is this will actually carry over line breaks when I email this to myself. And now I'm going to put hello and enter. And that's something else you could do in PHP. You can hit enter, and as long as you're still in these quotes, it's not going to generate an error message. Other programming languages aren't as flexible with that. So I'm going to put a user has submitted a message. Here is their info. I'm going to put name, then the name variable. By the way, another thing you could do with these double quotes is actually use variables in there without having to close those parentheses and then use the period symbol and space it out and everything. So that's another cool reason to use the double quotes. Name, email, message, and I'm going to put message like this, and that's it. And now I'm going to use PHP's mail function. All you do is type the word mail, and then the first parameter is going to be your email address. So whatever your email at your service.com. Whatever your email is, you're going to put it in this first, as your first parameter in this function here. And then the next field is going to be the email subject. So what do you want the subject to the email that you're sending yourself to be? A user has submitted a message. And last but not least, we'll put the actual message variable that we created here. And that's it. And save. Okay, and one last thing. I want to actually wrap all of this inside of that valid variable up here. That means if the user input, if there was no validation errors rather, then we could send this email to ourselves. So I'm going to wrap all this code in that valid boolean variable. And just tab it over so it makes it clean looking. There we go. So that way, if the name or the email wasn't left empty, then it'll send me this email. If not, then it won't send it. It'll force them to actually enter it in. And another thing I could do here is show a success message. Echo, congrats, your message has been submitted. That way the user knows that their message has actually been sent. So there was no validation errors or anything. And yeah, that's it. Alright, so I went ahead and tested the web form and it actually submitted to my Gmail account. So if you followed along and you got your message, then congratulations, you actually built your first web form. If you didn't get your email and everything looked like it worked, well, one point to make is that the PHP mail function is very iffy. Depending on what hosting service or web server you're on, there could be a myriad of reasons why that function doesn't work. And it can be security or firewall issues or ports or not even with your own server, but where it's sending it from. My message actually got flagged as spam because Google didn't recognize my web server and where it was coming from. So those are all the things you got to be aware of when you're using the PHP mail function. Alright, so we'll get into a little bonus round here now, and then I'll finally conclude this video. Just some extra pointers and something else you could do with user input. Let's say I actually wanted to validate the user's email address. This is something you should get in the habit of doing, especially if you create things like logins or sign-up forms in the future. You want to make sure that people enter a valid email address. And the way you could do that, PHP has a built-in function for that, and it's called filter var. So it looks like this. We'll put a condition if, open parentheses, and we'll put filter underscore var. And yeah, I know these predefined functions get very confusing. Some of them have underscores and some don't. And anyway, the first parameter in this function is going to be the email address. You want to validate the variable for it rather. And then we're going to put a constant in here called filter validate email. Now inside of this condition, I'll put if it's not a correct email, then warning, email address is invalid. Please enter a valid email. And then valid equals false. And notice in my HTML, I actually put type equals email. The browser will again utilize that to make sure that the email is valid. But again, we don't want to also use the browser as a crutch, especially if it's an older browser. It's not going to recognize that, and it'll let them submit it. So if you use this filter var function, it's very dependable, and it will almost always detect if a user's email address is valid or not. And so that's a little cool trick you could use. Alright, so when I submitted my web form here a couple times, my Chrome gave me an Ssl error message up here. So that's another point I just want to throw in this video real quick. If you have any kind of web forms on your website, even if it's a stupid simple contact form, it's a good idea to actually get an Ssl certificate on your website, because if you don't do that, the browsers are all getting, or the companies rather, like Google and Microsoft, they're getting stricter on this stuff where they want an SSL certificate on your website. So if you don't have one, definitely look into getting one if you have any kind of forms on your website. And by the way, you can also get ones for free. There's a service out there. They're called Let's Encrypt. So go ahead and Google that name. You can get SSL certs for free these days. You do not have to pay for them. So don't get one through your hosting if it costs money. And a last note I want to make is, by the way, I'll make a video on that in the future, SSL and how to use Let's Encrypt if you have your own web server. But anyway, one last note I want to make. Notice the post. I could have done these the same way I did up here, and it would be a better method to do this actually, because if any of these fields were missing, my PHP would give me a notice again. So if I didn't have the name field here and I submitted this, this line of code would actually give me a notice saying that name was a missing index. So a better way to do that variable here would actually be to do this. Change it to name and post. So this method's better and really the right way to do it. It all just depends if you have the notices turned on and how much time you want to spend writing PHP code all day. Honestly, I turn the notices off a lot of times with this stuff, but it's a good practice to write proper code and make sure that you're collecting all these variables the right way. And if you get into other programming languages as well, they are totally unforgiving of things like this, like especially in like ASP, it will just give you that yellow screen of death. So get in the habit of knowing and what these variables do, and when or when not to use them, and when to validate the indexes here and everything. Alright guys, that's a wrap for this video. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching, and I hope I helped educate you all on how to build web forms, and this lesson is just so much more applicable to everything else in PHP too. If you get into like sign up forms or logins or anything, now you have some of that basic foundation of how to build those types of pages and pass input back and forth between pages and all those kinds of things. So yeah, and it's also nice to have this knowledge to build these things yourself, a web form, instead of like depending on like a WordPress plugin or something like that. So yeah, it's powerful knowledge. And obviously I also only scratch the surface. Depending on what kind of website you have or things like that, you might want to have checkboxes or terms and conditions in them, and you might want to validate the user input even further, like only allow larger messages, and check for spam too. There's so many things you could do and you should do depending on how big of a website or how important your website is. So these are all things I'm going to get into in more detail later on, and I don't know what video lessons, but yeah, it's definitely coming. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you like these videos, please like, subscribe, and comment. It's the best courtesy you could give to me for making these videos, and I'll see you next time.